Welcome, everybody. We'll just keep everything on hold for a few seconds while we allow everyone into the space. Welcome to the webinar, Cottoning onto Climate Change. We will begin really very shortly. Welcome, everybody. We'll start momentarily. We're just giving a little bit of time for people to join. Thank you for making the time to join us today. We are going to start in 30 seconds and hope that everyone can get online in that time. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. We're very happy to be hosting you today. Okay, I think we should make a start. We've got a lot to get through this afternoon. So thank you very much for joining us. My name is Sally Uren. I'm the CEO here at Forum, and I'm your moderator this afternoon, hopefully steering us through a very ambitious and insightful agenda. Just a quick word about Forum for those of you that don't know us. If we can move to the first slide, please, Valentina. Thank you. We are a sustainability non-profit. We really try and use our expertise in systems change and futures to really create change on key global challenges. And one of our challenge area is sustainable value chains and livelihoods. And the Cotton 2040 project, which you'll hear all about this afternoon, is a key project within that challenge area. And we work in partnership with business, with government, across civil society. We very much believe that transformative change can happen when we bring all the different actors together in a given system to really try and transform that system. And the system in spotlight this afternoon is the cotton system. In terms of what we're trying to do today, we really want to shine a light on our most recent publication looking at the climate impacts of the cotton industry in the future, really trying to make the case for why we do need to stay below 1.5 degree temperature rise by the end of this century, looking at the predicted environmental and social impacts of climate change on the cotton industry, thinking through with voices from across the industry, what will those impacts look like from the perspective of brands, of producers, and really getting towards exploring what we need to do to build a future fit cotton supply chain. How might we respond to some of these climate impacts? And hopefully really inspire you all to get involved in driving a future fit and sustainable cotton industry in the future. So that's what we want to try and do. In terms of how we're going to try and do that, we have a webinar of two halves, if you will. We are going to hear in a moment from Charlene, who is the Cotton 2040 lead, give you a bit of background to the project. And then Ian will really give us a context of the climate change issues, really allowing then Alistair and Erin to highlight the key findings of the report. We then are going to move into a panel discussion, and I'll introduce our panelists in a moment, but we have a really brilliant range of panelists who will give us their response from their position in the cotton system to the findings, and then move on to the conversation about, well, what do we do next? There will be an opportunity for Q&A in the audience, so I would encourage you to pop any questions that might occur to you into the Q&A box. Also, if you wouldn't mind humouring us, use the chat function to introduce yourself, your name, your organisation, that would be great. Bit of housekeeping: if you're not talking, please be on mute, and that I think will happen automatically anyway. We do want to encourage further conversation about this webinar. So for those of you that like tweeting, and if you hear something inspiring or significant as we curate the conversation this afternoon, please use the hashtags on the bottom left-hand side there. We're really good to get a kind of Twitter conversation augmenting the one that we're having right now. And we are going to be using some live polling as well. So it's a very exciting and interactive webinar we have in front of you. So that's what we're trying to do: explore climate impacts within the cotton industry, shine a light on the report, think about what it is that the industry needs to do to drive a response to the findings of the report, few presentations, and then live Q&A with the panel, and time at the end for us to pose any questions to the panelists that you've highlighted in the Q&A box. I think we can move on to our first poll, which is a way of us getting a sense of who's in the room. So please click the right circle. Which of the following options best describes your role within the cotton sector? Are you a brand or a retailer? Cotton Standard Programme? Are you in philanthropy? Are you a producer or an organisation that supports producers? Are you a trader or a merchant? Are you with a consultancy? Are you part of a government department? Are you in the non-profit sector, or are you in academia or a student? Please take a moment to fill out your response. And this will give us a really great sense of audience that we have in front of us. And thank you all for introducing yourself on the chat. It's really lovely to see who we have in the audience. So we'll just let that poll run for a moment. And welcome to those that have just joined us. So who do we have in our conversation today? Oh, great, a really nice mix. So we have brands, retailers, cotton standards programs. Great, we have some producers. Interestingly, no one from philanthropy. Perhaps they're a little late. We were expecting some folk from that sector to join us. Consultancies, non-profits, and some representatives from academia. So a lovely diverse mix. Thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon. So without further ado, to start to provide the context for our discussion, I am going to introduce and hand the conversation to Charlene, who's going to give you a bit more background as to the Cotton 2040 project. Charlene.
Thank you, Sally. So I am going to give you a brief introduction to Cotton 2040, which is the initiative behind the report which you're going to hear more about today. Cotton 2040, as the slide is showing you, is a collaborative initiative that over the past few years has been working to drive the sustainability agenda across the cotton sector, working with and beyond any particular standard or certification or industry association, looking at the challenges that are of concern to all of us and driving collaborative action for a more resilient and sustainable future. If we can go to the next slide, please. I want to just flag the key areas that we are working in currently across 3 distinct work streams to achieve overall an industry that's resilient in a changing climate, that we're prepared and anticipating the challenges that are ahead. We're also working in another work stream on the theme of business models to look at the underlying causes of some of the really embedded challenges that plague the cotton sector that are connected with the business model. So looking for those that are really transformative. And we want to create a world where sustainable cotton is just the norm. It's not a niche. It's not a luxury item. It's just the way cotton is done. And this work over the past few years has been supported and made possible by the Loudest Foundation. And again, we work across all the sustainable cotton standards with many partners to really bring a new future into being for the cotton industry. If we can go to the next slide, please. I'd just like to touch briefly on the 3 work streams that are currently underway. Firstly, creating sector-wide collaborative action to understand and adapt to the changing climate. We'll be hearing more about that shortly. Secondly, we're working to increase uptake of a range of sustainable cotton options across brands and retailers. And there we're working with a cohort of over 12 key brands that are looking to increase sustainable cotton and helping to fast track that and really embed that quickly and fully in their sourcing strategies. And we're also working to continue the Cotton Up Guide, which we launched nearly 2 years ago. And that was our first step in really helping overcome some of the complexities that brands and retailers face when thinking about their sourcing options. And thirdly, our third work stream is working on sustainable business models, as I mentioned. And there we're really looking for business models that could be transformative in driving a future fit and resilient cotton sector. And if you're interested in business models, do get in touch. We're in a research phase currently, exploring what business models might be most viable. And then we're looking to pilot those later in the year and over the next year. If we go to the next slide, I want to just briefly address the aims of this first work stream on sector-wide collaborative action on climate change. And highlight that the reason we started this work stream is that we realized that there was an absence of an industry-wide conversation on what climate change might mean for cotton. And we weren't hearing a joined-up conversation really spanning brands, retailers, traders, producing organizations, industry organizations, thinking about what the future might be like, specifically in the context of the way the climate might be changing. And that, firstly, that data needed to be available in order to enable a joined-up conversation to happen that would really understand the implications, and then on the back of that, start planning for how the industry was going to respond and be prepared for, as we will hear shortly, the impacts that are now inevitable, but which we do have a degree of control on going forward if we take some transformative action on mitigation. So our aim through this work, and really launching with this report, is to enable a common understanding that leads to dialogue, that leads to action. And we'll be talking later in the webinar about how those conversations will continue over the coming year. And lastly, we couldn't do this work without our partners, and their logos are shown on this slide. And our partners really support us and have been supporting us through the research stage and will be going forward as expert advisors, as conversation partners, as a kind of a test bed for how we roll out this approach, and also critically enabling, in some cases, the financial support that matches the funding from Loudest Foundation that allows this work to continue. So a big thank you to all our partners who are involved in all those levels. And now I'd like to take us to our second poll. We would like to understand your current understanding of the impacts of climate risks to the cotton sector. And we are expecting people to be attending this webinar who might rate themselves, firstly, on a scale of 1, next to nothing. You know very little and you're here to inform yourself better. And you might, on the other hand, be all the way on the other end of the scale at 10, considering yourself quite well informed and able to make evidence-based decisions, or probably somewhere very much in the middle. So if you can, on a scale of 1 to 10, tick the circle next to the one that best describes how you feel your level currently is. So we'll just give a moment for you to tick the circle. And then we'll see in a moment, Valentina will give us a sense of where people are in the room. Okay, so we have, as expected, a spectrum. Quite a few of you hitting the marker at around 7, so reasonably well informed. We have a few experts or highly informed folks, and we have a few people who see themselves as on the starting end of the spectrum, and quite a few of you there in the middle. So that's helpful to know going forward. And a trick question, we're going to ask you again at the end of the webinar if that's changed. So thank you very much. Sally, back to you.
Thank you, Charlene. So thank you for giving us the context of the project. And what I'd like to do now is introduce our second speaker, who is Ian Watt, a climate specialist who's been working on this project for a while now. And Ian is going to set the broader context for what we need to know and why we need to think differently about climate change before we then deep dive into the results of the report itself. Ian, over to you.
Okay, sorry, I think I have now unmuted myself. Hello, everybody, and it's a real treat to get to speak to you today. Just a little background on myself. I've been involved with Forum for the Future for some 20 years now, 15 of those as a staff person, now as a Forum associate. So I do some other things, but it means I still get involved, I guess, when the stars align, which is typically when Forum is working with a company or a sector on its climate strategy. And to kick things off, first of all, I just want to say how much I welcome this research that Acclimatize have put together and are going to talk us through in a bit. I think it's an absolutely brilliant resource to help the cotton sector plan for the future. Next slide, please. Now, this slide outlines the four, I guess, provocations that Forum for the Future uses when starting a conversation with a corporate partner about climate change. And I want to draw your attention to the first one. This it sounds rather obvious, but one of the first things we advise a company to do is to better understand their exposure to climate risk, and climate risk in all its forms. Now, the research we're talking about today is really exploring the physical risks to cotton growing regions, but I think it's worth a quick reminder that physical risk is only one part of the climate risk puzzle. So there will also be transition risks associated with a necessary shift to a low carbon or a zero carbon society. And for example, that's things such as the regulatory response that is already happening, but more will be, it seems inevitable, investor pressure, changing consumer behavior, NGO campaigning, that sort of thing, but also new technologies, new materials, and maybe even new business models that will come into the scene as the world changes to both respond to a world that's experiencing climate change, but also a world that has to decarbonize. And then now I think increasing attention is now being paid to the potential legal and liability risks around climate change as well. I think that's particularly relevant for big emitters. So sort of think the equivalent of class action lawsuits against tobacco producers. But I think that there's also potentially some legal risks for companies that are perhaps slow to act and aren't at the front of the curve. So just something to bear in mind. But clearly for a sector dependent on agriculture, physical risk is clearly the place to start. And this analysis we're going to hear about today, looking specifically at the potential impacts on cotton and cotton growing regions, is exactly what's needed to inform a risk analysis and for the sector to start moving forward. It doesn't do that risk analysis for you, but it's an incredibly useful resource for the sector to build from. Next slide, please. This is just to give a quick nod that we all know that cotton already is susceptible to extreme weather. These three events are all flagged in the global report that's been produced, and all of them, and I think particularly the floods in Pakistan in 2010 resulted in significant impacts on cotton production and cotton price. And this research confirms for us that such events are only going to become more common, more severe, and more widespread moving forwards. Next slide, please. And indeed, I think the key takeaway for me from this research is that even by 2040, which isn't actually that far away, the negative impacts of cotton production are likely to be significant. The initial text there comes from the report itself. Under the scenario explored in this research, half of global cotton growing regions will face drastic changes by 2040. And I think we also need to bear in mind, and this is what this little graphic hopefully helps people think about, is that climate change is not just going to impact the production and processing of cotton, it's also going to impact more broadly across the cotton value chain. It'll impact supply chains, markets, and also the broader infrastructure. So things such as energy and transportation networks that the sector depends on as well. And risks to all those parts of the cotton value chain need to be considered as we build a collective response. Next slide, please. Now, I do want to flag that we have deliberately used a worst case emissions scenario as part of this research. And that's precisely because we think any risk analysis should indeed step into worst case territory or worst case possibilities. But the fact that we've looked at worst case emissions doesn't necessarily mean that the projections we'll be talking about later illustrate the worst case impacts on the ground. And that's for a couple of reasons. For starters, we're already seeing parts of the Earth system that are ahead of the projection curve already, and that's us at 1.2 degrees of warming. So Arctic summer sea ice and glacier volume are probably the most obvious ones. But worryingly, we're also starting to see populated parts of the world not just move towards the more inhospitable, but starting now to eke towards the inhabitable. And again, we weren't expecting that at 1.2 degrees of warming. There's also the risk of us crossing a planetary tipping point at some point, something that might cause a substantive or irreversible shift in climate. Now, for a long time, I think the hope was that if we stayed under 2 degrees of warming, we would avoid those. And indeed, that's one of the reasons why 2 degrees emerged as the upper level for our collective governmental action and hope. But some recent research has suggested they might be closer than previously thought. Next slide, please. So I think that means that what we need to do, and this isn't just for the cotton sector, but for all of us, is we need to find ways now to plan for the unexpected as well as the projected impacts, such as those outlined in this research. And that's a really tricky challenge for us to work through. So can we design a collective response that isn't just capable of handling the impacts that we're about to hear about, but is also sufficiently flexible to cope with some surprises that might be in the pipeline? And secondly, how can we best support and enable the wider decarbonisation that's required so that we don't collectively face the worst impacts that climate change might bring to bear? Next slide, please. And on that point, I just wanted to flag how rapid global decarbonisation has to be if we're to avoid 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. This chart illustrates how dramatically we have to reduce emissions to stay within the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees, as well as showing the longer we wait to act, the steeper the reduction has to be. If you look at the chart, had we found a way to reduce global emissions starting in the year 2000, the curve we had to be on is a lot less steep than what it is just now. Now, my reading of this chart is that the 1.5 degree target is starting to look close to impossible. Now, the wider narrative that we tell ourselves that, excuse me, net zero by 2050 or thereabouts is sufficient to stay within 1.5 degrees actually is dependent on an assumption that we'll find a way to extract gigatons of carbon from the atmosphere in the latter half of the century. So in that way, we actually exceed the budget, but find a way to make up for it in later decades. I fear that's unlikely. But even if it does come to pass and we sort of get that get out of jail card, we're still looking at emissions reductions that can only be achieved through the radical and rapid transformation of the global economy. And navigating change at that scale presents another set of risks for all of us to negotiate, as well as the physical impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. This chart just shows that if with a 2 degree budget, we obviously have a bit more leeway. But the emissions reductions required are still unprecedented. And I think we also need to bear in mind that for the time being, emissions have at best plateaued. They did drop some 7% in 2020 as a result of the various COVID-induced lockdowns we all endured. But the IEA, the International Energy Agency, has already stated that they expect emissions to pretty much recover fully in 2021. So next slide, please. So I think we all have to face up to the fact that some degree of the future is going to be disruptive no matter what. If we go above 2 degrees, and possibly even if we go above 1.5 degrees, the resulting geophysical change is going to put huge stress on the global economy. And I'd venture that the cotton sector, and given the parts of the world it's grown in, is going to be in the vanguard of that. Alternatively, if we find a way to stay under 2 degrees, never mind 1.5 degrees, we're only going to have managed that through the complete transformation of the energy, food, transportation, and possibly even economic systems. So either way, climate change is going to fundamentally transform the context within which all of us and all of our organizations operate. Next slide, please. And so to state the obvious, that means that adaptation, which for far too long has sort of been the neglected twin of climate action alongside mitigation, is now utterly essential. Some degree of climate change is now inevitable. We have to face up to that and we have to prepare for it. Now, the official definition of adaptation is something along the lines of what you'll see in your screen in red or deep orange just now. I'm drawn much more to some of these more human examples that came from this report produced by the Global Commission on Adaptation, which I think illustrate the wide variety of means through which the variety of responses we might have in our as we adapt. So, for example, there's things such as better warning systems, early warning systems for extreme events. We can tap into new crop varieties and agricultural practices. And in some cases, we can tap into old crop varieties and agricultural practices as well. We can better design and better plan our communities. We have better data that we can respond to understand the risk we face. And in some cases, simple changes to the physical environment can help. And to finish on a relatively upbeat note, I like this quote at the end here again from the same report, essentially saying if we do adaptation well, we're not just protecting people and communities from the impacts of climate change, we are hopefully able to better their impacts at the same time. And that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Ian. That was quite a tour de force outlining the challenges that we face. And I think kind of the take-home message for me is twofold. Climate change is going to fundamentally change the operating context for all organisations, all sectors, including cotton, and we'll hear more about that in a moment. And adaptation is essential, but adaptation can also offer some perhaps opportunity. But in terms of the way you're thinking businesses in particular need to respond to this challenge, what are the two top things that you think all businesses need to get really serious about right now?
So first one would just be to build from this research, and it's something I alluded to earlier, is that this research should help build a collective sectoral understanding of climate risk, and that in itself should plan a wider response. I think the key challenge, and it's something that's easier said than done, is finding a way to prepare for a dynamic future rather than just a predictable one. But that's a sort of exciting challenge to be part of. The second one I would say is to become a vocal and effective advocate for the wider decarbonisation of society. Governments still use the action in climate is bad for the economy and bad for business excuse for inaction. And it would be great, particularly the business voices in the cotton sector, to start yelling from the rooftops that it's in their best business interests for action there. Business voices have a credibility with certain audiences that environmental voices don't have. So please be vocal and speak up.
Yeah, absolutely. Across all industries, we need business to find their voice on this issue. Thank you very much, Ian. We are now going to turn to the details of the specific findings of the report in relation to the cotton industry. And I'm very happy to introduce Erin and Alistair from Acclimatise, who undertook the research, and they're going to give us an overview of their key findings. I actually don't know which of you is going first. I'm going to hand over to both of you.
Great stuff. Thanks, Sally. Yes, I think I'm going first. So, hi everyone, just a quick introduction. So yeah, I'm Alistair Bagley. I'm a Director of Corporates within the Climate and Resilience Hub of Willis Towers Watson, who acquired Acclimatise at the end of last year, hence the double badge on the slide. So next slide, please. Great stuff. So first, we'll just focus on the global study that we have completed now. I mean, this was quite a unique study. It's one of the first that's ever actually been undertaken, where we've analysed all of the cotton production areas around the world, and then started to look at various climate hazards and identify what those hazards and conditions are like today, but how those might actually transpire for the 2040s. So having mapped all of the cotton production regions of the world, we then used a range of IPCC research data to focus on a number of climate indicators, and those are listed at the bottom of this slide: growing season length, heat stress, total rainfall, etc. And we're then able to look at the conditions and how those change, driven by climate change, for the 2040s. It's a really innovative approach to use these kind of indicators, and really draw on the best available science that we have today, and essentially be able to develop insights around how these conditions are going to change regionally. Because what we do know about physical climate risk is it's not constant all around the world. It really does matter where you're located, where the cotton is actually being grown. And we can see some really large differences in the outputs and results from our analysis. So we've done this piece of work, this analysis, and they're now completed within 2 key documents, which are now openly available. There is a full report on the analysis, gives all of our methodology and how we've arrived. Everything is very transparent in our methods. There's no black boxes here. And we've also produced an executive summary, which is probably, I think, going to be the most popular document because you can scooch through and see a lot of the insights relatively quickly. These have been hosted on a microsite that we now have available. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Erin, here, who's going to take you through the next slide and tell you a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Alistair. Yes, if you press play there, Valentina, thank you. So in addition to the report, we've also created an interactive online tool, the Climate Risk Explorer tool. So all 12 hazard indicators are available to explore in your own time. On the right-hand panel here, as you can see, there's a narrative description of each indicator, its relationship with cotton and the source of the data used. To navigate your way around the map, you can use the overview map on the bottom left-hand side here by dragging the square directly to your location of interest. You can select a single cell to view the risk score to a particular indicator, as will be shown now. Or alternatively, you can also search directly for a region using the button on the left-hand side. Once you've selected your location, you can quite easily then toggle between the different climate hazards. So you can go from your heat stress, your rainfall, to your landslides, your wildfire, to explore the risk scores from these different hazards. And then, as you can see in the legend, the score for each hazard is presented as a relative scoring. So that is a scoring which is relative to all other cotton growing regions, from a risk of no risk to very high risk. You can launch the tool to play around with in your own time directly then from the microsite. I think we can move on to the next slide now once that's finished, Valentina. Perfect, thank you. So what did we find? What are the key take-home messages? So for us, it was half of the world's cotton growing regions will face drastic exposure to high or very high risk from at least one climate hazard. Cotton is exposed to both acute and chronic risks. The acute risk being those short and sharp extreme weather events, the chronic risk then being equally as important to consider the longer term incremental changes in temperature, rainfall, for example. Diving a little bit more into the individual climate hazards that we considered as part of the study, as you can see on the right-hand side here, we can reveal that 100% of all cotton growing regions could be exposed to risk from wildfire by the 2040s in the presence of sufficient fuel source, such as grasslands, shrubs, forests. We also found that up to 10% will be exposed to storms, up to 30% from landslides in mountainous regions, and 20% from fluvial flooding. Those are but a few examples of the acute risk. And then moving on to the chronic risks, for example, there's a potential that up to 40% of cotton growing regions will be exposed to a decrease in the length of the growing season. That's driven mainly by increasing temperatures. There are also regional trends, such as wind being a key issue across the Mediterranean, and then heat stress across Northeast African countries. But if you're interested, you can dive into these issues in greater detail in the full report, as Alistair said, which is available on the microsite. So that's the global analysis report and some of the key findings. And I'm going to pass you back to Alistair now to present the second task that we carried out.
Great, thank you, Erin. Next slide, please. So, okay, so the global analysis, because it's a global analysis and there's a lot of analytics that goes behind the results, we looked at hazards. But what we understand is that when we're looking at climate vulnerability or instances where we want to build climate resilience, we know that just focusing on the hazard is not enough. What we also need to do, and what we've done as part of the India study here, is do a deep dive where we've started to look at other dimensions of climate change, social dimensions. And if we look at this IPCC figure we can see with the Venn diagram in the center, we can see that actually climate risk is a combination of three main things: hazard, which we've already dealt with within the global analysis, but also exposure. That tends to be where you're living, for example, or where you're working, is it on a floodplain, etc. But also vulnerability. And vulnerability is key because that's when the socio-economic aspects of communities that are working with the value chain, actually those socio-economic conditions can both build resilience, but also create additional climate vulnerabilities. So because we could focus more at the India context, we could actually look at 3 particular states within India and 13 districts specifically that we identified where there was a high level of employment, either in cotton production, but also in cotton manufacturing, up to kind of pre-garment manufacturing stage, okay? So by being able to tap into census data or other socio-economic data sets, we were able to start to build a set of indicators that look more broadly to answer that question: what creates climate vulnerability? So essentially, we created 41 bespoke indicators in total. And as I say, they looked at both agricultural communities in a rural context, but then also looked at urban manufacturing communities. And as you can imagine, those communities, there's different stresses around sort of the climate risks in particular. And obviously from a socioeconomic point of view as well, the indicators are relatively different. So we split those two apart. But overall, it creates a full picture. So Erin, I'll go back on to you now for the results.
Thank you. Yeah, next slide, please. So the assessments for both the cotton cultivating and the cotton processing CRVAs reveal common indicators exacerbate risk across all districts. Looking first at the hazard indicators on the left-hand side, out of the portfolio of hazard indicators that we considered, the impact of heat on both the labour force and the cotton crop came out as key concerns. As you can see, the first bullet points, so we use the International Labour Organization's threshold of 34 degrees as a proxy to explore the impact of heat on labour force by the 2040s. So that's the impact on farmers in the fields and the manufacturers in the factories, for example. Heat stress is projected to give rise to a potential decrease in labour productivity, with, of course, knock-on impacts then on the cotton value chain. Looking at the second bullet points then, with regards to the cotton crop itself, the study used a threshold of 40 degrees as a threshold for which cotton yields are significantly impacted. And our study found that the number of days when temperatures exceed this threshold will increase across all districts by the 2040s. Turning now to the socioeconomic dimension of risk, the study identified common drivers of vulnerability, as you can see listed here. So we've got the poverty, we've got the involvement of women in the workforce, literacy rates, access to financial services such as ATMs, banks, etc., and access to technology and information. So what can we do with these findings? Well, understanding where the key drivers of risk lie is the crucial first step, as then with this information, it allows for the prioritization of the support and implementation of adaptation actions to begin then building resilience across communities and across the cotton value chain. Back to you, Sally.
Thank you. Thank you both very much indeed. Just really quickly, because I'm keen to invite the panel to discuss this. 10 seconds each. Alistair first and Erin. What was the most surprising finding in this work? Alistair.
Yeah, I think it was essentially the point that I was making there about the socioeconomic conditions, that when we look at climate vulnerability. But on the flip side, the sort of ways that actors within the cotton value chain can actually start to build resilience, there's some very profound socioeconomic issues which, by building and supporting those through impact investment, social investment, etc., we can actually start to really reduce climate vulnerability. So it's not all about the hazard. It's not all about the flood or the heat. It's about other socioeconomic conditions.
So building socioeconomic resilience can also build climate resilience.
100%. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, Erin, what
Yeah,
surprised you the most?
Yeah, I think the complexity, the challenge that the industry faces, I think surprised me. So the study did find that half of the cotton growing regions are exposed to high or very high risk from one climate hazard, but that's treating each hazard in isolation by itself, let alone if a hazard is impacted more than once in a group. So a farmer might be impacted by extreme heat one month and might be able to survive, but might be hit by extreme rainfall the following month, might be a different story, let alone then the cumulative risk across the value chain becomes quite a complex story indeed. Yes,
so holding that complexity in our minds, now let's turn to the panel to think about what their response is from their different parts of the cotton value chain, but to move into, so what might we do differently? So thank you very much, Erin. Thank you very much, Alistair. That was great. While we're waiting for the panelists to join me on the screen, can I just remind you, please use the Q&A function, post any questions that you have. If the previous speaker, so Ian, Erin and Alistair, you see any questions that you could answer as we have the following conversations, please do that, and then we'll have time at the end to pick up any questions that get promoted to the top. So you can vote for your favourite question. Please, I encourage you to do that. Well, as if by magic, I am joined by our panellists. So I'd like to say welcome to Phil from Primark, Philippe from Reinhardt, Amal Lee from CDC, and Alan, who's joining us from Australia today. And I think Charlene is joining us too. There she is. Great stuff. So we have got only sort of 30 minutes or so to have this conversation. And we've got 2 questions for each of the panelists. If I could urge you to be pithy and model conciseness in your answers, that would be brilliant. And I'm going to go to Amal Lee, if I may, first from CDC. My question is, how do climate change findings, such as the ones we've just highlighted, impact your decision-making as a responsible, socially minded investor? So here with Amal, we're looking for that response from the investor perspective. Amal, over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you. So, well, CDC is the UK's development finance institution and impact investor. We only invest in actually many of the regions of the world that we know now are very vulnerable to different climate hazards and risks. So Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa and India. So this report was it was an eye-opener without a doubt. I think to hear just the sheer amount of cotton growing areas that are exposed to very high or high risk, as was noted, is an eye-opener and quite shocking. On the other hand, this is also an area that we are very much looking into now, both within as we make and look to make more investments in the agriculture sector in cotton, but also through working with other DFIs who are also increasingly concerned. And I think one of the key areas that we are now very much trying to come up with a more common approach with our DFI peers and other investors is around the type of the way in which we can address physical climate risk. So having tools, and this very interactive tool that I did myself have a look at, I think it's exactly what we need, because we will need to get much more granular to understand exactly the risks that are are there, and to see how we can address them. Because again, as a development finance institution, we're not going to just walk away from these types of sectors, but rather we need to work out how we can address those risks and ensure resiliency as we make our investments in the cotton sector and other highly vulnerable sectors moving forward.
Great, thank you, Amali. And I think what's interesting there is you highlighting the granularity of the map that we produce will actually allow better decision making in terms of where that finance might flow through. Thank you for that. We're going to turn to the perspective of a brand, and I'm going to turn to Phil. As a well-known brand in this industry and a large-scale buyer of cotton, what do you see as being the most important role for a brand, and your brand in particular, in terms of promoting a resilient and a future-fit cotton industry?
Well, thanks, Sally, and thanks for inviting me to join the panel. And hello to everybody. Well, at Primark, cotton's the main natural fibre used to make many of our products, and we've been committed to bringing more sustainably sourced cotton to our consumers for quite some time now. And we've had our own sustainable cotton programme, which began back in 2013 with just over 1,200 farmers in Gujarat, and that's now expanding into other countries. And we're working with Cotton Connect and other implementing partners to train 160,000 farmers by 2022. So, but like many other brands, I guess Primark is now scaling the amount of sustainable cotton it's sourcing. But what this climate risk assessment report shows us, shows all of us, is that we need to redouble our efforts now in securing a resilient cotton sector. And the assessment's findings really bring sharply into focus just how precarious the cotton industry could be in the face of potentially devastating climatic impacts. And this could have obviously enormous consequences to the many millions of people whose livelihoods depend on this important commodity. And we can see that cotton farmers are going to be exposed to huge challenges when facing into these impacts. And as has been mentioned, this report already highlights that those impacts are being felt right now in some areas. So I think it's crucial that brands come together to continue to work collaboratively, more so in fact, to tackle this challenge. And over the last few years, the fashion industry has laid the foundation for lifting cotton farming onto a more sustainable footing, but we cannot be complacent, and we can't allow ourselves to think that the job is nearly done. The important work that's carried out by Cotton 2040 and partners really shows that there's now a renewed sense of urgency to move from a position of doing less bad in the cotton sector to really moving towards a position of being regenerative and restorative. And I think we also need a cohesive approach now rather than looking at raw materials in isolation. I think it's been highlighted already that there's so many interdependencies across the value chain and across the globe and across other industry sectors that we need a much broader view. So I think the subsequent work of the Cotton 2040 Planning for Climate Adaptation workstream will be critically important to maintaining those secure livelihoods for farmers and securing supply chain linkages for manufacturers, brands and retailers like Primark. And as brands, we need to send a very clear message to the whole fashion sector that we really must accelerate our efforts to decarbonise our own operations and our supply chains, and to start implementing those intervention measures for climate resilience now effectively.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you for mentioning the perspective of farmers and producers, because that's where we're going next. Welcome, Alan. From an R&D perspective, you'll be aware of the many constraints that cotton producers are currently facing. When you think about that producer perspective, are there any technologies, practices that you see that might be the most important to allow the industry to respond to this climate risk and to build a future fit sector?
Thanks, Sally. So before I answer, I just want to acknowledge I'm very conscious of the fact I have the good fortune to work in Australia, where the industry is well educated, highly mechanised and has access to the latest technology, obviously very different to where a lot of the world's cotton's produced. So there's obviously a range of challenges to implementing some of the opportunities I'm going to focus on. And so even though a lot of them are available and being used in Australia, their relevance and adaptability to other systems obviously needs close consideration, as does, and I think most importantly, and this is a whole nother topic, how best to support farmers to use them successfully. So turning to a couple of details, one of the advantages of the cotton plant is that it's a perennial crop and adapted to hot, dry conditions, and it will continue to produce fruit or yield as long as the conditions are suitable. So warmer temperatures through climate change at both the start and finish of the season will increase the time that cotton has to grow and produce yield, of course, provided you've got adequate water and nutrition. So as well as a potentially higher yield, the longer growing season offers more flexibility as to when the crop can be planted to take advantage of good soil moisture conditions, which can come obviously when the rain comes, so a little bit random. And also you can perhaps have more flexibility to avoid the very high temperatures that will likely come, or already coming and already exist. And so really, I guess, adapt your timing of your crop to the likely seasonal conditions. So it gives you both potential yield advantage and increased fibre quality, which should offer higher value. And in particular, if you can link that flexibility with planting and harvesting with breeding strategies for short duration varieties, the shape of the plant with a higher harvest index means it puts more of its energy into producing fruit rather than crop, then that's another opportunity. And you can link that with opportunities for improved varieties that are better adapted to coping with pests, diseases in particular, which might become more prevalent in hotter conditions. And obviously we need to adapt or adopt practices that make better use of the water when it does come available in both irrigated and dryland farming systems. So for irrigation, that could be technologies that monitor the soil, the weather, or predict weather conditions, the stress conditions of the crop, and looking into the future, if seasonal forecasting improves, then that gives more ability for farmers to plan further in advance. And I've just gone over the 3 minutes, so I better stop, Sally.
So in other words, there are a range of responses that would build in resilience to this changing climate, I think is what you were highlighting there. Well, that's
Yes.
good to hear. Thank you very much, Alan. We're now going to move to a different perspective, that of a trader, and move to Philippe from Reinhardt. Philippe, what do you see the role of traders being in promoting a more resilient and future fit cotton industry?
Hello, my name is Philipp Sahner, and I'm the head of business development at Reinhardt. Reinhardt is a family business. It's the oldest and one of the leading cotton merchants in the world. And our business was established more than 2 centuries ago in 1788 and is headquartered in Switzerland. So regarding your question, I saw from your poll that we have little trader and merchants available with 1%. So I'm happy to represent that role. International cotton traders such as Reinhardt link supply and demand across the globe. And our role is to respond and ensure resilience should any of the markets fail to supply or to take up cotton. And just to remind ourselves, cotton is grown in over 60 countries. About 90% is produced in the Northern Hemisphere and 10% in the Southern Hemisphere. And Reinhardt sources cotton from all exporting markets, and it's marketing into more than 50 countries. So as an international trader, we communicate across cultures and languages, and we link markets that otherwise may have challenges to even talk to each other. From our perspective, the cotton supply chain is complex, and which may be a challenge to transparency of cotton and to the traceability. However, the diversification also leads to stability and it reduces volatility. We believe that the complexity of the cotton supply chain and the many markets that grow cotton will allow it as a natural fiber to persist under a changing climate and remain for the future. From our own internal risk assessment and based on our experience, we conclude that we have most leverage to foster change where we hold minority shares in the cotton value chain. This concerns our involvement in cotton gins across different countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And what we can basically do as minority shareholders is we can bring us in. However, we cannot decide ourselves. And I think this is important to consider as well.
Great, thank you. And if there was one very specific role that you could identify as a trader to enable the industry to respond to this climate challenge and build resilience, what is that role?
Is that part of the second question already?
No, this
Okay.
is an additional
So I
question
think,
because you are our one trader and it's a really important perspective.
Yeah. I think our main role is the one I mentioned. It's to communicate and talk across cultures. I think that's what we can do.
Okay.
That's our role here. Talk with both sides, our
Yeah,
suppliers
so be that
and the retailers
connecting.
on the other side. So that's
Yeah,
what we
so
try
being
to
the bridge.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Charlene now, and panelists, please be aware, I do have one more question for you all, but I'm going to ask you to answer it in just a minute. So this is going to be a challenge of brevity and summation of your key points. So just put you on notice that whatever you had planned to say, I'm going to ask you to say it in less time, because I really do want to get to Q&A with the audience. So as you think about that, I would like to turn to Charlene as the person leading Cotton 2040 for more years than I care to remember. What kind of changes do you think are going to be critical for the sector to really embrace in response to this report?
So being brief, I'll mention just a few, but I would emphasize that I think what these climate reports bring out is that the scale of change that we need is not tweaks and adjustments, but really transformative structural change. There are a few areas that are really critical. Firstly, and most obviously, support for farmers. They're going to be really hard hit, particularly the most vulnerable, and they're going to need education and training. They're going to need long-term relationships to give them greater security. They're going to need support, particularly in transitioning to more sustainable and more climate resilient forms of production. So a whole area of work for farmers. I think for brands and retailers and consumers to understand that the land use pressures in the future we're heading for are going to put lots of constraints about what can be grown and where. And that's going to really drive the need to shift to more sustainable and regenerative forms of agriculture and circularity, so that we're not needing to grow as much virgin cotton and making use of the cotton that's already in the system. And I think thirdly, and most loudly, what I'd like to emphasize is that there is a lot that can be done by organizations working on their own to reduce their impact and make more regenerative approaches embedded in their practices. But there need to be structural changes across the cotton sector that range from the business models that we use that are based on, models from colonial times that are too often exploitative and unequal, all the way to thinking about how the cotton system is structured and where the hubs of activity sit, and really think strategically about where we invest our resources and where the hubs of cotton production need to be. So that's just a few. And I think I would just end by saying we need to think at the same time about radical mitigation and adaptation at the same time.
Yes, that's been a very strong message that has really made itself heard so far in this conversation. Mitigation isn't going to be sufficient. We absolutely do need to be looking at adaptation with, I think, the point that Alistair made, which is that adaptation through a very strong social and economic lens. Thank you, Charlene. So my final question to all of you from me, but there are questions waiting in the Q&A box and I would really like to get to. So going back to Amalie, if I may, and reflecting on the fact this is the year that we're going to see COP26. And obviously that's an important moment for governments to think about what they need to do in response to the climate challenge. And obviously the challenges that we've heard outlined that are facing the cotton industry are not specific to cotton. Many other global commodities are grown in parts of the world that are very vulnerable to the impacts of climate. So what's your wish for COP26? what does COP26 need to do to create the enabling environment for climate financing for all agri-commodities that are vulnerable to climate, not just cotton? What's your postcard to COP26?
Yes, thank you. So briefly in 1 minute, so adaptation is one of the top priorities for the UK COP26 presidency, and I'm actually advising the presidency team, are working with governments, but also critically the private sector, to ensure that the importance of adaptation, the need for much greater collaboration, the need for tools and better data and analytical capabilities, particularly within the private sector as well as within governments, that really is elevated at COP26. And I think we'll see both in the negotiations through COP26, but also the parallel processes. There's a Race to Resilience initiative led by the high-level champions, bringing together many businesses who are committing to this, to the need for resiliency. So I think we'll see these issues, extremely high on the agenda, and hopefully coming out of COP26, there'll be much greater collaboration and finance to support actions needed.
Thank you. And just sticking with that sort of government perspective, if I may, because this is a question we get asked a lot, which is, how aware do you think are governments and even their negotiating teams of the specific vulnerability of cotton? Or is there just a general awareness that global commodities are quite vulnerable? I'm just curious to know, because clearly government action in those parts of the world that are vulnerable will be important.
Yeah, I think there is without doubt growing awareness in those countries that are already being impacted. And I think, I think what's really good about the report is it shows it's not just the crop itself that's going to be impacted by, changing water patterns and temperatures, but actually also the human dimension and the ability of workers to be able to, harvest and that cotton. So, I think we're seeing, in those countries that.
Oh no, Amali warned us this might happen. Zoom is not her friend this week and is throwing her out temporarily. You did warn us.
Very sorry about that.
The thread.
Something with Zoom, I don't know what's happening. It throws me out occasionally. So I think, there is a growing awareness, but I think probably, not this level of understanding that this report now provides. So, critical contribution to addressing the issues.
So we need to think about how to sort of get that message out there. Thank you very much indeed. Phil, if you could send a message to other brands in the apparel sector in terms of what you would like to see as a response to this report, what would that message be?
Well, the message would be, firstly, read the report and don't just stop at the executive summary either, because there's loads of great detail in there. And this is going to be really helpful for businesses to navigate their way through the next few years as we approach 2040. So really invaluable. But I think what's clear is that what's considered sustainable today by brands is not going to be sustainable for the future. So we need to recognize that, and again, not be complacent, not rest on our laurels. And also we need to understand, these interdependencies that we've touched on, not looking at things in isolation, and even climate. I think we need to start to look closely at things like biodiversity and water strategies and stewardship, because they're all connected. So it needs a much broader overview.
Mm-hmm.
And then integrating that into the way we do business. But I think come together, get engaged, and just challenge yourself whether you're doing enough in your business to meet the challenges of 2040 as highlighted in the reports.
And this is a bit of an unfair question, but having read the report, is there any aspect of Primark's approach to sustainable cotton sourcing that you would dial up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to build this into our day-to-day decision making, and it will influence the way we just, the journey we take from here on. And as I said earlier, I think the next stage in fashion brands and retailers' sustainable cotton journey is going to be the most difficult and the most challenging, and we need to be ready for that. So I think we will be regrouping and having a close look at the report to take the findings and learnings from that forward.
Great, thank you for that. So keeping in with the theme of, what might need to be done differently, change in response to this report. If I could go to Alan next and sort of look for that perspective from the producer, the farmer. Alan, what do you think needs to change within the industry, or how does the industry need to change in order to better support farmers to respond to the challenges that have been laid out today?
So I have a confession, Sally. I said yesterday I'd be able to answer this easily. And having reflected, maybe not quite so simply, I think one of the problems we have is that we talk about the cotton industry, but it is literally millions of people who are individual business people. And so unlike a branded synthetic fibre that's got corporate controls and there's responsibility of one organisation, we don't have that ability to, I guess, drive messages, implementation of practices change. So I wonder whether we need to do a better job of linking the existing organisation. Certainly not going to advocate for a new organisation, but I think if we can better work out how we talk to each other as an industry, accepting that that's not simple given the sheer diversity in cultures, organisations, perspectives, business interests, et cetera, then that would be something important to do. To be a bit more specific, I think we also have an opportunity to better talk about the positives associated with the cotton industry. There's relentless negative information about cotton, certainly where I sit, which does wear you down. And we could do a better job of talking about the positive aspects, both with the changes that have been made to improve cotton production, but also some of the inherent advantages of cotton for smallholders. And I would be caution against a simplistic argument about food production versus cotton production, given how well adapted cotton is to hot conditions, the fact that it will produce a crop even in difficult conditions, it's cash crop for farmers, it's not perishable, international market, all those sorts of things. And lastly, I can't let Charlene's comment about the circular economy let go by. Cotton, I think we could also talk about cotton being truly circular in that it goes back to the land. I'd be nervous about talking about recycling fibres because unlike aluminium, the polymer length of cotton will degrade over time and you can't infinitely recycle polymers in the way that you can recycle other things. So we need to rethink a bit how we talk about circular economy in cotton. And that's enough.
That's a great provocation. I wish we had more time. I know there are some brands that are looking to source completely recycled cotton. I think what you just said, Alan, is perhaps that might mean that the integrity isn't there. But I think what you really shone a light on is, in terms of what the industry could do to support the producers, is sometimes have a more balanced narrative. There are positives associated with growing cotton. Like you said, it could be a cash crop in certain environments where it actually just isn't possible to grow anything else. So thank you for that. The final perspective is that from Philippe, if I may. And Philippe, as a trading company, what do you think either your trading company might do differently in the light of this report, or you can make it more generic? What is it that trading companies writ large might need to think about doing differently in the light of this data?
So that brings me to the second question now. And now for us and how we perceive it, cotton is an important source of family income. But we need to also look at it in the broader context of crop diversification, crop rotation, and regenerative agriculture, as Phil already mentioned, and that across the entire landscape. And so thereby linking the needs of the smallholder farmers that I mentioned in the context of sub-Saharan Africa and their families to the wider interests of society, such as mitigating climate change or adapting climate change, as I learned to go a step further. Now, we as traders, or how we see it, the context of following this up with our own priorities, We've identified 3 that we would like to continue. And the first one is the traceability of cotton, and that's sort of our economic product-related domain. Then the second one is the access to water, which is our environmental domain. And the third one is the capacity building of smallholder farmers and their family. That's a social domain. And I think it was nice to see also in the report that, especially in the context of heat, of drought risks, the importance of water there came up dominantly. Just to give you an example, I did a stakeholder assessment with smallholder cotton farmers in Burkina Faso in January this year. And it was interesting that they observe a shift in first rain by up to a month, which they directly associate to climate change. So if they plant too early, the seeds dry out. If they plant too late, then the heavy rains will wash away the seeds. So either scenario is a risk for them to lose the crop. And so we, as traders, we took back these learnings, and we now started to initiate projects and raise public and private funds to directly support our partners on the ground in sub-Saharan Africa. And I guess, again, that's our role, and that's what we can contribute based on the learnings that we have. To conclude, I think we need to remind ourselves that we work with many thousands of farmers, and we need to convince them about the best approach. We're not in a position to force them. Many of the farmers own their land, and they make independent decisions for their entire family to feed. So we can just basically propose a better way. And I think what is also important to keep in mind, that the next generation remains attracted by cotton farming to secure or to ensure a living income. We can't afford to lose out on the next generation to continue cotton farming.
Great, and that example you just gave in Burkina Faso is one of the ways that potentially that next generation could be incentivized to stay in the farming communities and to continue to kind of cultivate cotton. So that was super interesting. So we have the kind of the threads, if you will, of a response to the climate change challenge. So brands can definitely do things differently in the light of this report, come together more, create collective action. There's more that can happen in terms of support to farmers. The role of the trader sounds as though it will become more important actually as the industry really responds to these challenges. And Amali, thank you. There's a terrifically important role for COP26 and private and government and private finance in terms of building resiliency within the industry. So if you will, Charlene, turning to you to kind of put a bow on that sort of set of different responses that might lead to a climate resilient industry, can you tell us a bit about why this notion of a just transition is so important to climate resilience in cotton?
Yeah, and I think building on what the other panelists have already said, we know that there are already really major challenges in the cotton industry around equity and around smallholder and farmer income and so on. And climate change, while it will affect everyone, it will affect the most vulnerable much more significantly, and they'll have a much less ability to come back after challenge after challenge after challenge. So we're really looking for the industry to actively set in place ways to support farmers, ways to ensure that they have the adequate income that they need to survive and continue to produce. In some cases, it may not be possible to continue to produce cotton. I can't predict from the reports what regions those might be, but in some cases, things may just get too hard and it's no longer viable. And the industry might need to think about exit strategies and looking at how do you help those farmers and those communities either transition away from cotton or combine it with other forms of livelihood. And I think the rationale for doing that is in part to maintain production, to maintain the the farmers who provide us with the cotton that we need. And on another level, it's also a simple question of social stability. There are many, many people who rely on cotton for their income. And if they don't have support through a just transition to continue earning their living from farming, then they will be in very desperate straits indeed. So I think we need to be thinking about that now and actively working to set solutions in place that provide more of a safety net and resource and a greater equality across the value chain.
Great, thank you. So I really appreciate those comments from all of you, and I think all of your comments really highlight the fact that this report is very, very much needed in the industry, and in many ways should act as a wake-up call, because it's very clear that things need to start to happen very differently as of now if we're going to ensure a future fit and resilient cotton industry as we go forward. So lots of practical ideas and way forwards there, with this notion of a just transition at its heart. Climate is a social and economic story. It's not just an environmental story. But let's have a look at what's been happening at the Q&A. And Charlene, have you spotted any juicy questions that we could pose to our panelists?
Yes, indeed. It's a busy place, and it's helped by all those of you who have been liking particular questions that have already been posed. So top of the list is one really important question that I'm hoping that Phil and perhaps Philippe might answer, posed by Lucy Swain. Is there a risk of buyers moving away from purchasing from high-risk areas based on the mapping? And that is, of course, a question that we've thought a lot about in bringing out this data. How can it be used responsibly? So I'd love to pose that question, and I would suggest Phil and Philippe might be, for starters, the best place to answer.
Okay, I'll have a stab first. So yeah, it's a good question. I think, as I said earlier, Primark, as many other brands, have already been invested heavily in sustainable cotton programs and scaling those. So, you know, there is clearly an ethical requirement, a duty of care to support the farmers in those geographies and to continue to do so. That's part of our program. It's as much a social program as it is an environmental program, and it's important to remember that. I think the report will certainly have an influence on future sourcing strategies for brands. I think that's true. And, you know, some of those are going to be difficult decisions to make, but it is going to have some influence on where brands look to source materials and downstream production in the future. But again, you know, it goes back to our whole sustainability strategy. It needs to be comprehensive. It needs to be cohesive. And it needs to enable us to operate in all regions of the world where we feel we need to, and that's what we'll be looking to do going forward. But yeah, it's a good question. I'll let Philippe add a perspective from the trader angle.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. Great question, and I think I have to be very open about projecting into 2040. As traders, we have to be very responsive what the market says now, what our predictions are for tomorrow. And in many cases, they're wrong because there's so many interacting factors that are hard to predict of what's going on. And the last year's pandemic has been a showcase of not knowing what's going to happen tomorrow. But nevertheless, I think in the end, we as traders, or also at Reinhardt, today we source more certified cotton than we sell. And I think there is an opportunity there for any market which can supply the demand to produce the cotton, and also sustainable cotton. And we are a strong advocate for African sustainable cotton. That's run under Aid by Trade initiative. And I think that's also how we see our approach. We see trade as a support for the smallholder cotton farmers and give them access to global markets. I personally see today the main challenge in international legislation, which can drive us out of markets completely. And I think that's where we have the risk today, that some farmers may not be able to access a market for reasons being right or not. But nevertheless, I think that's what's driving us at the moment. But I can't really say if a 2040 climate change risk will drive us into any particular direction. I think it's just out of our hands at the moment.
Thank you. Charlene, as you're scooting for a question that we might pose to Alan or Amal Lee, just a quick word to the audience. We here have got a third poll ready for you in a moment, so please stay with us as we run that third poll. We'll do that in just a short while. We've got 4 or 5 minutes left for questions, and then we'll bring the meeting to a close. So be ready for the third poll. It's headed your way very, very shortly. But Charlene, is there a question for Alan or Amal Lee?
Yes, there is. And there are an awful lot to choose from. But I think the one that stands out is some questions from the panel on the timeline for transition of farmers to climate smart agriculture, and who should fund it. So how that transition comes about, and it'd be interesting to hear that from Alan and Amal's different perspectives.
Who'd like to take that first?
Over to you, Amal.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so now, clearly there is a critical role here for DFIs and other development banks that can work to either address some of the risks and try to build out more resilient practices that will, reduce the climate risk in a particular context. Or I think, as was said earlier, and also I noticed, questions specifically around the just transition agenda, look to invest in those other activities that bring other social and economic opportunities. And actually it's quite timely that just this morning CDC with LSE and also the India Observatory Forum actually launched it's a stepping stone, if you like, to a just transition financing roadmap for India to focus on exactly these issues, looking at both the transition out of fossil fuels, out of coal, but also looking at the agriculture sector, given very much the risks here. And happy to I can share the link to that in the chat. But this is absolutely something that we are very focused on right now.
Great, good to hear that. Alan, any quick comments from you on this issue?
I think just quickly, to be specific, if a focus on plant breeding as one of the many options that need to be integrated as a solution, you are looking at reasonable periods of time, 8 to 10 years, but it integrates so many things because the plant is obviously the ultimate thing that copes with the climate, the changing climate. So if you can get the plant to do a lot of the hard work, then that's obviously a good solution. But it does take time.
Great. Thank you very much. I think what we will do now is to run the third poll and see if anything's shifted from when we ran the second. So this was a poll we ran at the beginning. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you now rate your current understanding of key climate risks? And well, hopefully we won't see a spread towards the lower end of the spectrum, but it will be interesting to see if there's been any shift in the light of this conversation. So where's your understanding now? From 1, it's still very low, to 10, I now know so much more. I feel very well equipped. Let's take a few moments for people to click their button. Thank you, Ian. It's possible to know more, but feel less equipped. Hopefully not. So this is great stuff. The spectrum has shifted slightly towards 10. So that's very heartening. I didn't know what I was going to do if it went in the opposite direction. That would suggest that something has gone really badly wrong, but it hasn't. And hopefully, as a result of this conversation, your knowledge has increased. Just as we're closing off, and I'll just give an indication of what we might be doing now in the project. First of all, I would just like to thank our speakers and our panelists. And for those of you that are still with us, in the chat box, if you wouldn't mind, would you humour us and add in what, if anything, is one thing that you will do or do differently as a result of this webinar? What are you taking away in terms of something that you might do differently? Just be really great if you want to share that in the chat. Something might have occurred to you that you want to do differently. But in terms of the key insights from the report and from this conversation, we've clearly heard at least 3 very compelling messages. We have to look beyond mitigation to adaptation, and that means putting social justice at the heart of the sector's response. We know that if we can build social and economic resilience, we build climate resilience. And that's why this whole energy around the just transition, and great to hear Amali, the CDC's work that launched this morning, is so critical. We can't look at these issues in isolations, and we need to develop these systemic solutions. Climate is one of the most significant systemic challenges that we face, and we all need to work together. It's very clear from this conversation that we need brands to take action, traders need action, growers and financiers. We need to enable the flow of finance to build climate resilience in the industry. I think I have one last slide, Valentina. So yes, our invitation, Cotton 2040 is one of our longest standing projects at Forum. We really do want to, with our partners, many of whom are in the call today, we really want to transform the industry so that sustainable cotton is the norm and really shift from conventional to sustainable cotton. So in order to do that, please get involved with the initiative if you want to find out more. We're always looking for new partners in the project. We've got workshops coming up where we'll use some of the findings that we have shared with you today. And just an invitation to use the report. It's brilliant. It should really help navigate some of these climate risks. So our invitation is to use the report, come along to the workshops and get involved in Cotton 2040. It's a very broad church. We have a whole range of different actors, and we'd love to see more exotic brands, colourful brands join our partners that we already have here today. So thank you all very much for sparing an hour and a half of your time. We really appreciate it. And we really hope that this report does act as the wake-up call that we wanted it to, and really be a defining moment in the cotton industry, one where we get really serious about climate change and work much harder on mitigation. Let's strip carbon out of our operations, but let's get really serious about adaptation and think about how we can deploy finances, resources, brand equity to build a future fit and resilient cotton industry. Thank you all very much. This has been recorded. We will be sharing it for those that couldn't attend the session, but really just another huge thank you to our speakers, our panelists, and the Cotton 2040 team who work behind the scenes to really bring such webinars to life. So thank you all for everything, and please stay tuned. There's lots more where this came from. Thank you.